Right on time. Welcome to Arctic Frontiers 2024. Actions and reactions. Global actions, Arctic reactions. My name is Andreas Rospotnik. I'm again your host, your digital host at Arctic Frontiers. As you can see behind me, we're a few minutes late, like in any good conferences. People are floating in. There's still a queue, so we're waiting for more people to join us. Unfortunately, I guess you're a few more than expected online, as we have experiencing quite some weather issues here in Tromsø. But to all of you who are joining us here online, again, welcome. Hope you enjoy it. Please ask questions. You can do it online. Just make sure that you always highlight to whom the question is directed to. And then my colleagues here at Arctic Frontiers will make sure that Susanna, our moderator, will ask the right questions you pose to our audience. One of the new things we do this year is that I will recap all discussions after each panel session. We're going to have 20 minutes conversation with other participants of Arctic Frontiers, and those recaps can then be watched online after the conference. So again, please ask questions, please follow us online, please tweet Arctic Frontiers. Enjoy the conference to the fullest, even being abroad wherever you are. Provide us with feedback, and next time please join us here in Tromsø if the weather allows. Again, enjoy Arctic Frontiers 2024, actions and reactions.
Kjære deltakere, kjære gjester, velkommen til Tromsø, hjertet av Arktis. Vi i Troms fylkeskommune er stolt av å være vertskapsfylke for denne viktige konferansen. Vi skal la oss inspirere, vi skal dele kunnskap, og vi skal prøve å finne bærekraftige løsninger. Verden påvirker oss her i nord. Om det er konflikter, klimakriser, uro eller folkevandringer. Men det er kun sammen vi kan finne felles løsninger. La oss snakke med hverandre, la oss dele med hverandre, og la oss finne felles løsninger. Lykke til med konferanse. Velkommen til Tromsø.
Welcome to the Arctic Frontiers Conference. Since the start in 2007, Arctic Frontiers has brought together key voices of science, policy, business and local Arctic communities. with the aim to transform knowledge into impactful actions that help shape the future of the Arctic region. Today, more than ever, the importance of holistic discussions grounded in credible knowledge cannot be overstated. We are committed to using this platform to contribute to regional development and building competence by sharing knowledge, networks, resources, and best practices. We are gathered in Tromsø in the spirit of collaboration, exploration, and innovation to make a lasting impact of the sustainable development in the Arctic region. Thank you for joining us in this endeavor.
Velkommen til Tromsø, den arktiske hovedstaden. Her bryr vi oss om de viktigste spørsmålene. Det er klimaendringer, det er geopolitikk og ikke minst det gode liv. Vi har kompetanse og kunnskap til å møte fremtiden, så ønsker jeg dere skal være med på laget og hele uka bruke Tromsø med de mulighetene som finnes her. Ha en fantastisk konferanse.
Welcome to Sápmi. At Arctic Frontiers, we meet to discuss possibilities and challenges of the Arctic, and we do that with a warm heart gazing towards the future.
Minister, State Secretaries, Madam President of the Sami Parliament, Excellencies, dear friends. Polarization has reached the Arctic. The division across the lines of conflict can seem, at times, too sharp. Between global needs and traditional livelihoods, between global unrest and security and stability, between universal values and the power struggle to define what is true. Too few seem willing to listen, too many reluctant to compromise. Standstill is getting closer. The feeling that we're facing an insurmountable task. But if we accept the reality can be changed. Because the first step to solving a problem is recognizing that there is one. We must realize we are risking a standstill. We must understand what we break, we own. We have to accept that we are the ones who have to solve it. The solution calls for decisive leadership because the global relevance of the Arctic will continue to increase. Prime Minister Olof Palme once stated, "Politics is about making choices." To this I add, pragmatism is a necessary ingredient when making choices. The Arctic task can only be solved through consultations and practical choices. It requires leaders who make choices that can't be escaped, leaders who explain why and build narratives that unite, not divide. Solving a deadlock requires mutual will to give and take. The Arctic Council is still an Arctic Council for all 8 Arctic states. That is an example of pragmatic leadership and consultations. In order to act rather than react, we have to choose and sometimes dare to lose. Can traditions be adapted? Can we acknowledge that not all opportunities can be pursued? Can climate crisis be solved without sacrifice? We have to choose and sometimes dare to lose. Politicians must think beyond short-term gains. Democracies must learn again to neighbor dictatorships, but never compromise on human rights. This is pragmatism in action. No one can have it all, but everyone gets more than they feared. Are we facing an insurmountable task? The answer is no, if the following principles apply. We must always place knowledge at the center of decisions. We must always face diversity with respect, and without exception, choose dialogue with those of us who call the Arctic our home. Welcome to Arctic Frontiers 2024.
Coexistence is the defining challenge in the Arctic today. Be it the coexistence of states in an era defined by geostrategic competition, the coexistence of an already fragile Arctic ecosystem with emerging economic opportunity, or the coexistence of Arctic communities and their ways of life in a rapidly changing Arctic.
In the Arctic, all stakeholders must invest in coexistence efforts to address the precarity of climate change and how it disproportionately affects Arctic Indigenous peoples.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Arctic Frontiers moderator Susanna Streeter and our conference host Dr. Andreas Raspotnik.
Hello everybody, and it's a real pleasure to be back here in Tromsø, really at the crossroads of global security issues, climate threats, geopolitics, and so many other issues facing this region right now. I'd like to thank Anu Fredriksson for that really insightful speech opening this event, which really, put the nail on the head of all of the different challenges, but opportunities that we have ahead of us. Of course, we need to keep all channels of communication open. And so I'm very, very pleased that so many of you could brave the weather, the trials and tribulations of the travel to get here today. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the audience. We have had to change the lineup a little bit. Thank goodness for technology to enable us to do that. Some of our speakers will join us remotely. But be ready for some really insightful debates which really will move the dial and hopefully give you the takeaways you need to return to take action. I'm very pleased to say that I did arrive a little earlier. I did worry about the weather, so I had the opportunity to take in some of the delights of Tromsø, including swimming in the Arctic very briefly on Saturday. So I've already taken the lead there. And I'm also very pleased to be back with Andreas here on stage. And Andreas will, of course, keep you very entertained throughout this conference.
I'll do my best. Thank you very much, Susanna. I know you also faced some challenges with Jürgen Klopp leaving Liverpool FC, so thank you very much. You made it up here despite this big change in UK football. If the light wouldn't be that bright, I would see many familiar faces. So again, welcome to Arctic Frontiers despite the weather. Good reminder that we do indeed are in the Arctic and Arctic challenges are real. My job here is still the same, to inform you about a couple of practicalities. One of the first job is, please let's again thank and applaud Arctic Horns, the band you just heard, and their title Actions and Reactions. A very familiar title, I would guess. So big applause to the band. And the second very important one, same as last year and the years before, we are concerned about your safety and health. So if you hear a fire alarm, it's not a test, it's not a trial. Please leave the room either this way or behind me, or this way to the left where the other conference room are. Again, it would not be a trial. Let's just leave in a calm manner. I follow Susan and then you follow me and we are safe and sound. And the last one, we have a new deliverable, let's put it that way, here at Arctic Frontiers. After every big picture, we will recap the big picture in a 20-minute discussion with participants. So if you're stuck at the airport when you're traveling back from Tromsø, you can bring Arctic Frontiers with you and watch a little recap of each session on your computer or your cell phone. So I hope we'll manage to get a very engaged discussion up here and also then on Recap TV. I guess that's it for me. I'll leave you here with the panel.
Thank you very much. We certainly will be catching up on everything you have on Recap TV, which will also be on YouTube. So, Andreas, for now, thank you very much. So, of course, over the past year, since we were here this time last year, we have had the ongoing cost of living crisis. Of course, we've had fractured supply chains and very, very fractious geopolitics as well. But despite this, we have seen signs of progress, not least the amicable Arctic Council chairship transition and greater steps forward in terms of the green transition as well. But as we all know, there is no room for complacency because we do still need urgent cross-border action to really take head-on those challenges facing the Arctic. So this session is going to really focus on the global and Arctic state of affairs, examining the influence that global actions have on this region. And to set the scene, I am very, very pleased to introduce up to the stage Norway's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Espen Barth Eide. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan, and it's great to be here at Arctic Frontiers again. Madam President, Senator Murkowski, who I think is following from afar, State Secretaries, ladies and gentlemen, great to be here. And Arctic Frontiers is close to my heart because Arctic issues are close to my heart, and the Arctic Council, which we now chair, well, we have the chairship. Remember that, not chairmanship, because my predecessor very rightfully took the man out of chairship. But also because when the second Stoltenberg government was formed in 2005, I was working very closely with the gentleman who's now our prime minister, but was then about to become the foreign minister of the time, about a High North strategy. And we declared in our government platform in 2005 that the High North would be the #1 strategic priority for the Norwegian government. And when we came back and had, took over government again in 2001, we basically repeated that message, that this is really super high on the government's agenda. It is, and it should remain so. But it's a very different Arctic circumstance, which is the theme here, precisely because of this action-reaction theme. Back then, we expected relations to Russia not to become easy, but easier, that we would have closer relations, that there were new economic opportunities in cooperation. And in many ways, we Norwegians, we saw Barents cooperation, Arctic cooperation, obviously as something for all the involved, but it was very much kind of based on the belief that Russia would change to the better. The second thing we thought at the time was that this region would become, would have a bonanza on energy, particularly fossil energy, gas, exploration and exploitation. And that some of this cooperation would be in that area. Now, both of these assumptions are gone, right? We simply have to admit that while we hope that for better times in the long run, relations to Russia and geopolitics have caught up with us, actually we were able to collectively, all of us together, all the member states of the Arctic Council, was able to shield the work in the Council from the cold winds of geopolitics that lasted until a few years ago, and we all agreed, America, Canada, Russia, the Nordics who were there, all agreed that we should try, but with the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, that was not any longer possible, and there is no reason to think that it will change anytime soon. So that's, of course, a changed circumstance. The other one is that while, of course, there will be still some need for oil and particularly gas, it's not going to be the dominant theme. The dominant theme for growth in the world, in Europe, in Norway, in the High North, and in this part of the country will be into all that which follows from the green transition. So there's a new circumstance around the key issues that brings us together that we have to recognize. But the flip side of geopolitical change has, of course, also been that two of our immediate neighbors, not only Norway's immediate neighbors, but North Norway's immediate neighbors, namely Finland and Sweden, are now either already members of NATO or very soon to become members of NATO. And that means that we are all in not the same club, but in a series of same clubs. We will now have a full security policy and defense policy integration in the Nordic countries. Remember, those of us, and I know the Secretary General is here, there you are, the Nordic Council, which is great, and the Nordic Council of Ministers, a great institution, long history, always important, was prohibited from dealing with these issues because while we were socially, politically, economically close, we were very different in security politics. That's gone. So there's a new opportunity for cooperating on these crucial issues of security among the Nordic members of the Arctic community, and of course working closely with the United States and Canada, just on the other side of the little ocean, which we thought was just ice, but when we realized it's basically an ocean, that if you sail through it, which you eventually will be able to do, unfortunately, you'll end up in Alaska or in Canada. So So that's a very different circumstance that creates some political opportunities that we also have to reap. So we are now adamant to make sure that we maintain and develop where we can the Arctic cooperation with full recognition of the new limitations, but also grasping all these new opportunities. And what are they? Well, if the world is going to do what we all set out to do as late as in Dubai, the last climate conference, COP28, in December, namely to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels, we also have to do what also is said in the same statement. We have to triple the investment in renewable energy. We have to build all those energy use, all the technology for using clean energy. We have to develop greener industries. Now, this part of northern Norway, northern Sweden, northern Finland, and adjacent areas have vast resources, a lot of minerals and metals and rare earths, a great potential for producing clean electricity, a great potential for industrial growth driven by that green transition. Now, since President Mokhtar is here, I should immediately say that this is not uncomplicated, to put it carefully, because there are other concerns that we also need to take into account. And this is one of the dramas of this very necessary green transition, that we have to find credible ways of thinking about how, on the one hand, we replace the old with the new, which does require more resources, more, blending more resource from nature, and using it, to build, the windmills and the solar panels and the batteries and all the new stuff, without making unnecessary harm to nature because of biodiversity and so on, but also to other and traditional interests, like, for instance, reindeer herding, which is a main theme. So these are issues that will not go away. Quite on the contrary, there will be a more dominant theme of discussion. So these are examples of action-reaction, how the world influences the Arctic. But the other and last point I want to say, because I'm sure I'm overstepping my time, as I normally do, is that the Arctic also influences the world. And again, there are lessons to be learned from Arctic cooperation. For instance, the fact that we actually basically have no territorial disputes left. They are fundamentally all solved in this region. Even if we have geopolitical divisions, there's not really a serious quarrel about territory. That's fantastic. Tell that to anyone around the South China Sea, and they would thought that sounds good. We have been able to develop sort of practical, concrete, bottom-up cooperation that actually delivers key things. That's something to learn. And of course, climate change. I talked about the opportunity that comes with the green shift, but climate change goes faster here than anywhere else on the planet. Actually Svalbard, Spitsbergen Islands, you'll find the land spot on the planet with the fastest change. Admittedly, it was rather cold when they started, but the relative change is colossally much faster, up to 4 or 5 times faster in North Spitsbergen to the global average. And even here where we are now is probably 2 to 3 times over the global average. It goes fast, and probably the reason we had trouble getting up here, and my state secretary, Maria Valteresian, was on 7 different planes, none of them left. But she tried, seriously, and she's now in charge of this and has a background from Arctic Frontiers, by the way. But that might also be related to a very rampant climate change. And what happens in the Arctic will not stay in the Arctic, because we can see the effect on biodiversity loss, biodiversity change, changing habitats. We're seeing how what used to be Arctic is becoming Atlantic, which is very worrying because you have collisions of species, for instance. You're also seeing permafrost thawing with all the consequences of that, both what happens to infrastructure on permafrost, which is a major Arctic theme, but also what happens with sort of the emissions of stored methane gas under the Arctic. And the Arctic currents, where the water masses that comes up, goes around and goes down, that has been the refrigerator of the planet. And the world, imagine a kitchen with or without a refrigerator. Which one would you prefer? A world without a refrigerator is a troubled world. And we can see that before others because we're here, we do science, we do research. And you said it in your introduction, we have to be knowledge-based. And we have a principle in the government, which in Norwegian is called fakta har makta. At least they should have, means facts have to rule. And we really need to make sure that we have a knowledge-based, wise, insightful understanding of how we deal with politics. And that's exactly why we are here in Arctic Frontiers, and that's why we are here in this discussion here, and that's why we need to think about action, reaction, and how reaction leads to new action, and so on. And the Arctic is just in the middle of that. Just remember that if you just look at the globe the right way, which is from the top, which is normally what you look at things from, you will see we're just in the center and everything else the periphery. So we are now in the center of the world, in the Arctic capital, Tromsø, discussing the issues of the planet with a cold environment, but a warm heart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you. Please do come and take a seat, Minister. Please do come and take a seat on the panel. Thank you. And I'd like to introduce the rest of the panel. Now we have Arctic right at the heart of this discussion. So please welcome to the stage State Secretary Lauri Tiarala from Finland. Also, Silja Karina Mutka, President of the Sami Parliament of Norway. Welcome. Welcome to you both. Welcome. And also, please welcome remotely, because of course, due to the travel disruption, not all flights were able to land and get anywhere near Norway. So US Senator Lisa Murkowski, representing Alaska, is joining us remotely, as is Douglas Jones, Deputy Assistant Secretary from the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the US Department of State. He was also hampered by the bad weather. So let me bring in Senator Murkowski to start off with, who's been listening to the Foreign Minister's speech. Senator, tell me, what is your viewpoint on just how nations should prioritize the risks ahead and how to deal with them? And what role should the Arctic play in protecting the rules-based order?
Well, Susanna, thank you first for the opportunity to be beaming in. I know better. Somebody coming from Alaska, my hometown right now is 45 below. So I'm no stranger to cold weather. So I should have planned ahead like all good Arctic citizens do and give myself an extra day to have been there. I'm sorry to not be there in person to participate in this dialogue, and really disappointed that I'm not going to be able to join the Arctic policy discussion later this evening at the brew pub when real conversations come together. But I do appreciate, once again, the opportunity to share discussion and dialogue with those that are gathered at Arctic Frontiers. I appreciate very much what the Foreign Minister has laid out in terms of not only the challenges, but the opportunities that we see in the Arctic. When we think about actions and reactions, so much of what we are focused on, unfortunately, is a reaction instead of being proactive to how we view the world around us, the risks around us, the threats around us. And it's hard to just encapsulate all of that and to treat them in isolation, because the threat that we see, the risk that we see due to climate, is not something that we can look at in isolation. The impact that we see to our infrastructure, when we see permafrost degrading, the impact that then has on our economy, what that means in terms of investments, then in terms of how we respond to that, how the people who live there respond to that. We all know that we're seeing an outmigration of young people in the Arctic. In fact, the last Arctic Frontiers conference that I was part of, the panel was focused on outmigration of young people and what we can do to keep them there. If we don't have good, strong working populations, if we don't have families that are wanting to stay in our area, how do we have an economy? Of course, the threats to just the defense space and the growing reality that as we are seeing an opening in the Arctic, we're seeing not only levels of of commercial opportunity, but also growing threats. In our area, through the Bering Straits, we're now seeing Russia moving through oil tankers as they're seeking to evade sanctions. And we're seeing, unfortunately, vessels that are moving through that are perhaps not Polar Code compliant, increasing the risk of some kind of an oil spill or some environmental catastrophe. So again, when we talk about the risks, nothing can be looked at in isolation. So how to be best prepared? That's one of the things about the Arctic. You know you cannot survive in the Arctic unless you are prepared. So I think that the peoples of the Arctic, when we think about the local knowledge, the traditional knowledge, the ways of knowing, this is where we really bring assets to the table in terms of preparedness. And so focusing on not necessarily our reactions, but more our positive actions in terms of what we are doing, working together. Mm-hmm. In the United States, we have stepped up to our role in the Arctic. We're making the investments, whether it is in polar security cutters so that we're more prepared up north, infrastructure, a deep water port in Nome has just received the final go-ahead. We are making those investments that are necessary for an Arctic environment. The other thing, when we talk about prioritization, in your question about what role should the Arctic nations have in protecting the rules-based order? As the foreign minister has said, so much of this is the dialogue in coming together. This means the stepped up role that we're seeing among the Arctic nations when it comes to the role of NATO and what that means for preparation and defense. In the United States now, and actually hopefully this week, we are having a great debate about the ongoing support for Ukraine. This is one example of how, as nations, we have to be there for one another. Now, while Ukraine is not necessarily in our Arctic region, we know that threats within the region require all of us to step up. So it is not an option for us to fail on support for Ukraine. Keep pushing us. We have to lead. We must stay in this. And the effort here this week hopefully will demonstrate just that.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Senator. And I just want to pick up some of your points and put them to the State Secretary from Finland. So there was a focus that the Senator was making on we need to act, not just react. To what extent would you say that Finland has already been doing that in terms of security? Have you pushed security, obviously, even further up the agenda, given the NATO changes? And what can other countries learn from your approach?
Indeed, first of all, thank you for having me. Good to be here, and I really like the way that the minister put the discussion in the framework of action and reaction. We're obviously in a complex world. When someone takes irresponsible action, there's never knowing what the reaction from others will be, and obviously the ones who initiated the illegal war of aggression against Ukraine did not realize that the reaction would be Finland and very, very soon Sweden as well joining NATO. But what it means for action, if we try to take one step forward, I was away from government for a period until my party won elections, which is a nice thing to have, and then they brought me back in when I thought I had quit politics, and one of the very concrete changes I have noticed is how much more we are now in interaction with the Norwegian government, not only today but constantly, and I think it underlines how much our viewpoint has changed. Yes, we take a serious look at security, also in the Arctic, but also perhaps from the Finnish perspective, realize better the risks related to being, in effect, an island in the Baltic Sea, and that our lifeline in addition to the Baltic Sea, is via Norway and in the Arctic. And I think it has helped us to strengthen our Arctic identity quite a bit, actually.
I'm going to pick on that point in just a moment, but I also want to bring in, Madam President, and draw on what the Senator was saying about this need for dialogue, this need to come together. And obviously we hear a lot about the focus for new opportunities, security priorities in the High North. But what does this mean from the perspectives of Indigenous leaders? How important is it that you are around the table right from the beginning? What is kind of true collaboration?
I think I must start off with a way of thinking, and it is when you identify a problem. And I think we must acknowledge the fact that in the core of all these issues are human. Humans are in the core of security politics, energy questions, other kind of questions. So it all evolves about the people. And we are the people. So we cannot, the indigenous peoples in the Arctic, we cannot be a problem. We are a solution also. And I think from the indigenous perspective, if we think that every other authority is a problem to us, we will have problems with the dialogue. And dialogue, I think that is a very interesting thing, because when it's true and intended, will to try to speak and also to take actions that are responsible and follow up on the things you are saying, then you have a much better situation. And I am worrying, because all this focus on solving energy crisis in Europe, establishing new very strategic mineral facilities in the north, it also make the hotspot more insecure. And I think often when you argument about those things, you say you need to do this to strengthen the security in this area. But we lack people, and if we lack people, we are vulnerable. And when people don't see a future in the Arctic, then we will struggle, whatever kind of facilities one would have to have a wish to establish here. But you have to respect indigenous people. We have rights, they have to be acknowledged, and you can't compromise on human rights. So we will be glad to participate in difficult decision making, but then it has to be through processes in order to accommodate the needs we have.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm going to put some of those points to Doug Jones, who is joining us also remotely. Hello there, Doug. Thanks very much for joining us. I know you've had travel chaos as well. But let's pick up on a few of those points. You were part of the US mission to NATO. What is your assessment of the effects of NATO's expansion for Arctic security? But also, what do you make of President Motka's point about the fact that this search for new natural resources to power the Green Revolution could actually spark fresh conflict further down the line?
Well, thanks, Susanna. Sorry I couldn't be there again this year in person. I made it to Oslo at least, so close yet still so far. And thank you for letting me participate virtually. You asked about NATO specifically, and so we just saw Sweden receive ratification from Turkey. I was honored to personally receive the instruments of accession in my hands on Friday. But we still have Hungary to ratify, and so we're looking for our Hungarian ally to quickly act and finalize Sweden's membership in the alliance. Their membership. Eventual membership, Finnish membership, this is a direct consequence of Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. I think that it means greater security for Sweden and Finland, certainly, but for all the allies and for the Arctic region as a whole, because there will no longer be any more seams or gray areas for Russia to exploit, as they have in Ukraine. When Sweden joins, 7 of 8 Arctic nations will be in NATO. That'll have great implications for the Arctic. There'll be more NATO in the Arctic. It also means there'll be more Arctic in NATO. It's going to transform the alliance as well. There will be tremendously more opportunities for cooperation and integration security among the Nordic states and with the other allies. I would also point out it's important to remember NATO is a defensive alliance. Also, NATO is primarily an alliance of values. NATO will mark its 75th anniversary this year. It did not become the most enduring alliance in history because of its military strength, but because all allies commit to uphold the values of democracy, individual liberty, and human rights, including in the High North. And so even as we need more deterrence and defense through NATO and individually in the High North to respond to the increased threat from Russia and the increased military presence of Russia in the High North, it remains the common goal and the common vision of the Arctic allies of an Arctic that is peaceful, prosperous, and cooperative. And though it seems hard to imagine as Russia's actions rise tensions in the north, still our ambition to maintain the Arctic as an area of low tension.
Okay, thanks very much, Doug Jones. And I just want to pick up on another theme that we have from Madam President, specifically about the concern that she has expressed about the strive for the pursuit of new natural resources. Could that create a particular hotspot for the Arctic region? Is that on your radar? And what steps are you taking to try and defend against that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, first we have to recognize that there is an intrinsic, complicated problem here, which is that on the one hand, we need these new resources because those are key elements in the green transition. Some years ago, we thought it's okay that we find them in Africa, China, or Russia. Now we don't think so any longer because we want to have better control. We allies and broader West wants to know that some of this is produced in Western countries and through by decent means. But that collides with other uses of the same landscape, and there is an issue here with indigenous peoples, and not only, but definitely also indigenous peoples who are custodians of unspoiled nature and who are indigenous people. Why are indigenous people still here? Well, because they got something right. That's why they survived. There were many people who were not here, but somebody got it right, so they have something to teach us as well. So that's the one challenge. Of course, the other one is that as an area becomes more economically interesting, of course, more people will take an interest, but I'm not so worried about that because there are, as mentioned, we are now 7 out of 8 Arctic countries will now be NATO countries. That means Article 5 applies. You normally don't mess with Article 5 countries. You might mess with non-Article 5 countries or non-NATO countries, but you don't. And secondly, the delineation, territorial disputes do not really exist any longer. We have solved them. And that was good for sunny days, but it's even more important in rainy and windy days like we have now. So I think, on the contrary, I think that the more we have people here in North Finland, North Sweden, North Norway, the more presence, economic activity, people, that's also good for security policy because it's good to have people in your land and not sort of vast empty spaces.
Okay, thank you. And I'd just like to put a question that's come through from the audience, because you talked about the fact that we cannot concentrate on kind of old sources of energy, and it really has to be the green transition where the resources go. And this question says it's clear that the biggest geopolitical threat is the burning of fossil fuels responsible for current climate change. So how can Norway justify offering 62 new production licenses on the Norwegian shelf?
That's a good question to which I have an even better answer, because the thing is we need to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels, and that means that we need to invent, develop, enhance, grow all those replacements which will make it easier and easier and easier and less expensive to do everything we do fossil, non-fossil. But as we work towards this, there will still be a demand for both oil and particularly gas. And much of what's happened in Norway is that we have moved from being a predominantly oil-producing country to be more and more of a gas-producing country. And in some countries, gas is part of the transition. It's not the end state, but it's part of the transition. And with the possibility to add CCS, carbon capture and storage, to gas, you can also see the development of green and blue ammonia and green and blue hydrogen, who will be replacement of more traditional fossil forces. So the energy transition is not like first you stop one thing and start another. You're moving from one to another in a strategic manner. And Norway is very adamant to be part of that. But there is a warning, because demand from what we have been living very well from will eventually go down. There's a pause. There was a longer lease of life because of the war, because people who are decarbonizing would first like to decarbonize from Russian gas, but eventually they will also decarbonize away even from Norwegian gas. So when we think really long term, this matters. But in the coming days, there will still be a demand, even if we are adamant to accelerate the green transition.
Okay, well, many thanks for that. I've
heard that question before.
Yes. So let me, I just want to go back to one of the issues that the Senator brought up, the very fact that there is this kind of migration from the north. What implications does that have in terms of security? What is Finland's approach to this? And is your concept of the total defence actually helping you in this respect?
If I start with the migration, indeed, within Europe, we're one of the latest countries to actually see people moving into cities. So at the moment, we are seeing, unfortunately, a trend where people from both eastern Finland and especially northern Finland are indeed moving south towards the south. And this is an issue. Side note, as long as I remember, you President mentioned the rights of the indigenous people. Our government just in December submitted to Parliament, finally, after many efforts, reformed act on Sami Parliament, and hopefully that will now be finally passed. But that's of course, in migration terms and in terms of population, only a small thing. I think the bigger thing is the economic sustainability. Of course, there we are. Just these weeks, I think next week we'll be finally launching a new program for northern Finland, where we'll be looking at also cooperation with Norway, transport corridors, etc., all these energy investments. Because obviously, as said, we've all heard the talk for the past 20-25 years that there's so much potential. Now it's starting to materialize. But whether it's materializing into livelihood for the people who actually live in the region, that's the key question.
Well, let me ask you, do you think this increased cooperation in the Nordic region, when we're talking about this increased cooperation between Norway, Sweden and Finland, do you think it really can help create new business opportunities for locals and indigenous people in the region?
I certainly hope that. But during the pandemic, we have seen what kind of small challenges we have, and we have small Sami municipalities where the borders are going straight throughout the communities, and we have one culture across the border. So this is not, we are not so hampered by the concept border in our mind, but in the actually everyday life we do feel the restrictions on every small kind of thing. So that is something we have to solve. And that is why also in the Summer Parliament we will engage more actively in the Nordic Council framework now, because we do see that this is something that is important for us. We do need a Nordic Sami Convention. It is very important for us, and we certainly hope the act will pass Parliament on the Finnish side. But also NATO is something that we need to have a we have to have good and necessary processes on, because military presence must be enhanced. And so I have had meetings with the Norwegian defense authorities, and of course when NATO forces are coming to practice in the Arctic area, Norway area, they are also entering indigenous area, and there are certain regulations that applies to that. So we certainly need to have true communication and good processes on that issue. And what I would also like to say, the defense they must actively try to engage also indigenous peoples within the defense system, because we have knowledge about this area like no other. And so that I have addressed with the Norwegian defense authorities, and we are trying to work on this, but there are improvements that has to be accepted on.
What kind of improvements?
I do think, for instance, it's not enough to send a letter. If you want true engagement and plan, actively planning, then you can, we can steer away from a lot of the challenges that can occur if we are using enough time on the planning.
Okay. Well, many thanks for that, and I'm sure that you'll be taking note. A quick question about the transition, the amicable transition that we've seen in the chairship of the Arctic Council, as you mentioned in your speech. What's the next steps? And in particular, do you think there should be continue to be a pragmatic approach? I mean, there has been criticism about some of the cooperation with Russia, but what's your stance on that going forward?
So thank you. This is a very central question, because on the one hand, I think we all agree, I mean, we, the 7, agree with the 8, that, you know, we need to keep this forum relevant and we need to keep some level of contact. And what has been achieved already, which is, for instance, search and rescue cooperation and certain sort of environmental regulations and principles for sailing and so on, should still be there. On the other hand, we don't want to use this for political contact or any high-level contact at this very stage with Russia. So we're trying to find a pragmatic and practical way to keep the organization at 8 alive, to maintain what we had, some research, technical level cooperation, maybe written, maybe digital. We're discussing that right now, but recognizing that there are limitations. And then, of course, the rest of us continue to work on all the issues that have to be progressed in this area, including everything that the President just said, because it is absolutely extremely important to remember that one of the core ideas behind setting up the Arctic Council was to involve indigenous peoples. And relative to other organizations I know, they have, in principle, a high level of influence on what's happening in the Arctic Council, more than in many other bodies. But that should be used now as there is sort of Nordic cooperation, national regulation, to take inspiration from the experiences. And I really hope that President Mokhtar and her colleagues will be able to reach out to the Russian indigenous peoples. That's complicated right now, but they are, of course, also, they also need our solidarity and support in these circumstances. So that's an important bridge that the Council hopefully can play.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Let me bring back... Oh, go ahead, Secretary.
If I may, because I wanted, since the very interesting introduction to our panel and excellent introduction on the issue of pragmatism, which of course...
Very Finnish.
It's very Finnish. We are often, I don't know, proud or a bit ashamed of it, however, but it served us usually quite well. But at the same time, I think that we've learned over the years and decades and centuries that there are cases where pragmatism and compromises work, and partners. And then there are cases and interlocutors with whom we know that they are using the so-called Lenin method, trying with a knife, searching for a soft spot, and then when they find a soft spot where you are ready to make a compromise, they push deeper. And I think the art of leadership is actually differentiating between these two, and it's very difficult.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Then let me bring back in Douglas Jones, who's in Oslo for us. Doug, can you just, really drawing on the points that we've heard, and this kind of pragmatic approach, what kind of hopes do you have that the solutions to the Arctic's challenges are achievable, perhaps in this manner?
Well, I think there are lots of reasons for optimism. We've talked a lot about the challenges we face, huge challenges, the consequences of Russia's aggression and its attempt to overturn, a lot of the principles upon which international cooperation have been built on. We're still feeling the repercussions of that. Climate change, of course, having a disproportionate impact. But there's a lot, the Arctic doesn't just react to global problems. It's part of the solution and has a lot to offer. I think we should talk about how, Russia's assault on Ukraine and its undermining of international cooperation in the Arctic has not divided the other Arctic 7. In fact, I think it's drawn us together, and there's more unity than before, more cooperation, and I think an even deeper commitment to these principles that, because they're under threat from Russia, but we have a community of states in the Arctic that's committed to democracy, human rights, to open societies, and I think willingness to defend the hard-won rules of the international order that have served us well in the past. Also, the Arctic is a huge center for innovation. Lots of innovation and new ideas coming out from the Arctic, technology, climate research. There's lots of examples. CarbFix in Iceland leading on carbon capture and storage. Kerecis leading in biotech, medical, biomed research. Even in Tromsø with the BioNorth project. So there's lots of contributions coming towards these solutions. And finally, I just have to say we have to talk about the indigenous peoples. As the foreign minister said, they have solutions and they have a lot to teach us. And also, I would say, in the way that they have really modeled and been able to be trailblazers in ensuring that their voices are heard in international fora. And so we've seen that both in, as we look for inclusive climate solutions, for protect our resilient communities, indigenous-centered economic development. These are all great causes for hope and optimism.
Well, that's good to hear. Well, thank you very much, Doug, for that. Douglas Jones, really appreciate your time. Before we go back to Senator Murkowski, I just want to ask you one last question that's come from the audience very briefly, but it is a big issue. So what concrete actions is Norway taking to build knowledge base about the environmental impact of future deep-sea mining in the region?
Again, thank you. There has been, as I said, we believe we need rare earths and mining and metals in order to build the green transition from land and potentially at sea. But we have not opened any exploitation as of now. We actually said that we are ready to investigate whether that's possible. We need to learn more about the technical feasibility, but also the environmental impact, and we would only actually open for real exploitation much further down the line if that science and insights and investigation proves that can be done in an environmentally friendly way. That's the way we develop many other businesses in this country. We have been living off natural resources since, for centuries, but we've learned that it has to be done with respect to nature. And I think neither is it correct to say that we know a priori that seabed mining is better than land-based, nor do we know that it's worse. We don't know yet. We know there is a big lack of knowledge, so we have to get that knowledge first and act later, because, as I said, fakta ma makta, facts have to run the world.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It certainly ties in to the theme in the opening speech from Anu Fredriksson. Well, let me bring back in Senator Murkowski, who's been listening to all of this remotely, of course. And Senator, I just want to get your response particularly to this question, which I know has been top of the agenda for the emerging Arctic leaders. How can we ensure that cooperative Arctic governance remains our guiding principle?
Well, I think that the first place to look is the example that has been set by Norway as they assumed the chairship from Russia. There was, we all know, a great deal of anxiety as to how this was going to unfold, what signals were to be sent. And I think the way that Russia handled it with the support of the other Arctic nations, the 7, is exactly that model. It was firm, it was respectful, it was clear, and we've proven to not only those within the Arctic, but those who look to these Arctic nations for guidance as to how to ensure that there is a cooperative attitude and environment going forward. And it's not just the Arctic Council. We talk a lot about the Arctic Council, and rightly so, as that governing or that entity that is that overall umbrella of Arctic governance. But there are other entities. We've mentioned today the good work of the Nordic Council. I have been a member of the Standing Committee of Arctic Parliamentarians that, again, works to develop these cooperative relationships within our own legislative bodies. There's the Arctic Mayors Forum, and I know that Patty is there and has presented and is part of this dialogue that is so important at the sub-regional, so it pushes up that level of cooperation all throughout. We have the Arctic Youth Ambassadors that are there. When you think about the benefits that come when our young people come across to gather in places to share best practices, to share their concerns and their worries and what they believe their future to be. And hopefully that future is there in the Arctic. When we're talking about outmigration, how can we bring those young people back? Right now, well, I guess in about a month, Alaska, the United States, is going to be hosting the Arctic Winter Games for young people, primarily from Arctic nations, to come together in a way that is fun, it's cooperation. I think about all of these different aspects that, again, demonstrate that this is how not only we want to operate, but that we will operate. One last point about engagement with our Indigenous peoples. We also know that conflict can come from within our own borders as well as externally. So making sure that whether it is a resource development project, whether it is issues of climate and food security, development, economic opportunities, to bring in the voices of our Indigenous peoples, to ensure that when we talk about consultation, it is more than just a check-the-box exercise, but it is true, meaningful dialogue at the outset. That is how we avoid that confrontation. That is how we ensure that Arctic governance at all levels remains cooperative and is really that hallmark of our region.
Okay, well, many thanks, Senator, and I do appreciate your contribution to the session. Disappointed you can't be with us, but it's great to hear from you nonetheless, loud and clear. So many thanks to the panel, and I want to, just as they leave, just pick up on one of those themes about the importance of the views of young leaders. And I mentioned one of the questions that was top of the agenda for the emerging Arctic leaders. Well, you can watch now a film that they have made talking about their thoughts and their fears for the future and the questions they really want us to answer. Thank you very much.
Jeg får helt klump I halsen av å tenke på det. At det kanskje ikke fisk I havet til min sønn, fremtidig barnebarn og oldebarn.
Mumbalan at min alamagis I lahpohta aiki.
Какамирох Алакус.
Я боюсь, что в мире больше никогда не будет мира.
Ho paura che un giorno la luce non si accende più.
The world today has multiple crises that impact the Arctic, and the Arctic impacts them.
The Arctic plays a vital role in supplying essential resources needed to tackle global challenges. We must leverage the Arctic's potential without condemning its future.
So, we ask, how do we balance our long-term needs with short-term global crises? How do we ensure that cooperative Arctic governance remains the guiding principle?
So another question to ponder, and before I invite the next panel on stage, please do let's give a warm round of applause to the first panel for some really great insights already today. But now, please, can you welcome to the stage Oskar Stenström, who's the Senior Advisor and Director of Wallenberg Investments, based in Sweden. Welcome. Also, Orrin Young, Distinguished Professor from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Welcome. Hello, Orrin. Wonderful to have you with us. Thank you. Please also welcome Karen Ellman, Secretary General of the Nordic Council of Ministers. Welcome. And also Andreas Usgarden, expert in geopolitics and the High North. Welcome, Andreas. So Andreas is a change to the previously published programme because of travel chaos, but I'm very excited that he can join us on the panel, given his expertise, particularly in the realm of security. First of all, Karen Ellman, I'd like your view on that question that we heard there from the emerging Arctic leaders. How do we balance our long-term needs with short-term global crises? It's a big question.
It is.
Do you have an answer?
It is indeed a big question, but a very relevant question, of course, because, well, one could say, politicians, okay, you only have like a 4 or 5 year term, so maybe you're just in it for the short run. I think we just heard the opposite in the previous panel, and that's what's needed. We are here right now, and we, all of us, bear the responsibility for the future. So keeping on insisting on international cooperation, international dialogue, the pragmatic way that the Minister of Foreign Affairs was very vocal upon is indeed necessary. So dealing and being very aware of the soft power as well, the responsibility for the soft power, making sure that the Arctic is the place where you want to live, where you see the future for you, your children, your grandchildren. That's not just a matter of making sure there is a green, successful transition. It's also a matter of making sure that you can live safe lives, interesting lives with culture, with activities, with jobs. So that's, I mean, that would be the answer. So you keep on having the long light in the work that you do and insist on international cooperation and dialogue.
Well, many thanks for that. And there was another key question there that the Senator answered a little earlier, and I'd like to put it to you. Or really focus on trying to ensure cooperative Arctic governance and that it remains the guiding principle. I mean, what do you feel about the priorities of the Arctic Council at the moment? Do you worry that short-term crises are taking over the narrative?
Well, I think the narrative is a critical issue. I'd like to start with something that the Minister said in the previous panel. There are no intractable conflicts rooted in the Arctic. Sure, there's increased concern about security, and sure, there is deepening hostility between Russia and the Arctic itself is a relatively peaceful place. And so I worry very much about the attention from what I see as the larger and deeper concerns. The Minister spoke a lot about changing circumstances in the Arctic, but there's also changing circumstances. In the beginning, if we go back to the 1990s, when we set up the Arctic Council, the Arctic seemed like a somewhat remote region of interest mainly to the Arctic states. Today, the Arctic is of interest to the whole world. And so when we talk about cooperative governance, it's no longer possible just to say this is some kind of an arrangement which we construct and manage and operate as a cozy little operation among the Arctic countries. Operation in the Arctic. And I think that has very big implications for the mechanisms and how we structure and manage Arctic cooperation. I'd like to come back to that if you'd let me, but maybe you want to give us
go
some of the
ahead.
questions first.
Yes.
we have to understand that the Arctic Council has certain kinds of capacities. The Arctic Council does not have the authority to make decisions, nor the resources to implement those decisions, but the Arctic Council does have the capacity to identify emerging issues, to engage in assessment and monitoring, and I think very importantly, to have the convening power, to bring together in the same place a very wide range of players and interests, not to make decisions, but to have open and frank discussions about options. And then you have to remember that the Arctic Council is not the only game in town. So if there is an issue identified by the Arctic Council plays a very critical role, but we then turn to the International Maritime Authority, which has the authority, if there's an issue of fishing, we then create something like the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. And by the way, the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which has 10 members, not just Arctic countries, is alive and well. Conferences of the parties are occurring under the terms of the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. So it's a complex tapestry of governance where the Arctic Council is a piece or a part of that tapestry, but we have to weave it together with these other components and these other elements.
And that point that you were making about your concern about security is potentially taking over the narrative. Well, let me put that to Andreas. I mean, your research is focused on Arctic geopolitics and potential conflicts in the Arctic. How concerned are you then about current developments? I mean, do you think the strategies being taken are enough to diffuse and stop escalation or potentially inflame tensions?
I'm still quite concerned. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with Oren, and I don't disagree with the foreign minister either. I mean, there is no resource race for the Arctic. There are no territorial disputes in the Arctic, yes. But parts of the Arctic, and I think that's an important element as well. It's not all of the Arctic, but parts of the Arctic are extremely important in a wider geopolitical tension because of Russia's strategic forces on the Kola Peninsula. This part of the Arctic that we're in right now is crucial in a NATO or US versus Russia military buildup. That's not because of Arctic issues in and of themselves, but they are occurring in this part of the Arctic. We're seeing increased military activity in this part of the Arctic. And as the senator also highlighted in the previous session, we're seeing increased Chinese-Russian military activity off the coast of Alaska. Again, not due to Arctic issues, not due to fisheries or oil and gas or shipping, but due to global tensions. Are we doing enough, or as you say, are we dealing with these issues sufficiently? Perhaps not. I mean, on the one hand, how do you deal with an increasingly belligerent neighbor as Norway is facing, and as also Russia, no, the US is facing across the Bering Strait? You deal through deterrence. Right? We are inviting NATO and the US and other allies to come here and help us showcase that we are willing to defend ourselves, we're able to defend ourselves. At the same time, we also have to talk to Russians. We have to make sure that if an escalation happens, maybe intended, perhaps unintended, at sea, for example, that we can diffuse that situation. So we need to keep channels of communication open. And finally, as was also highlighted in the last session, we also need to involve the local population that are actually feeling this increased military activity. Again, not due to Arctic issues, but it is occurring in the Arctic.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me pick on that point. Is that the key reason Sweden wants to join NATO because of that? It's the deterrence. I mean, you, Oscar, you served as the State Secretary to the Prime Minister responsible for the Swedish NATO application. You know, what points, what grounds were put forward at the time for that? How do you see the strategy now and going forward?
Thank you. I mean, basically, I served the Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson in Sweden, who always said we need to see things how they are. And we saw what happened the 24th of February, 2022. And that's the big picture also for the Arctic. What's at stake here? It's a member of the UN Security Council, which is breaking international rules. So if we set up rules here in the Arctic and we have one member that does not obey, and these are fundamental rules, you don't kill other people by invading them. There was tons of statues that were broken and are broken by Russia. And that was totally clear for the Swedish public opinion in the spring 2022. So it was a no-brainer when we coordinated. We had to wait another day for the Finns to sort out. You know, they have a president and a prime minister. We have a king and a prime minister. So we handed in the NATO application May 18th. And that was based on what happened in Ukraine, of course. And this is the big battle for us. We can't lose the war in Ukraine, because then we don't have any chance to solve the big things that we need to solve together here in the Arctic. So this is what it's all about.
So you think then, in fact, that dealing with short-term crises does lay the groundwork for longer-term security and the possibility to address all the other longer-term challenges head-on?
Yeah, but I'm not sure that is a short-term crisis with Russia. Hey, this will take time. We need to team up. That's why we have joined, or soon will join, NATO. I was a bit slower as the chief negotiator for the Swedish government than my Finnish friends, but soon Hungary will ratify us. But this is much bigger than NATO. This is about the big deterrence. This is how our industry can build capacity together. And that's where we in the Scandinavian countries need to straighten our backs and see that we are 27 million inhabitants. We are the fourth biggest economy in Europe, third if we count European Union. Sorry, UK. And the growth pre and during the pandemics has been extraordinarily good. So we are attractive for investments, but this will take time. So I'm not sure it's a short term.
And you talk about investment. Is that one of the reasons why you believe that bolstering security is so essential to attract that investment that you want?
I mean, I don't think, now I'm working for a big private family, Wallenberg in Sweden, who owns many industrial companies, but you can never separate industry from deterrence, and you can't separate industry, military, and the civil. We will have AI, we will have a lot of civil applications. Our societies needs to be resilient, climate change, but also military threats, and that's why industry will be an essential part. If we run into a conflict in Sweden, food crisis will occur within 2 or 3 days. We need to buckle up to make sure that we can deal with both the environmental crisis, but also right now the hard deterrence against a big nation in the UN Security Council that has invaded one of our neighbors.
Karen, let me bring you in here. You've called at the Nordic Council for deeper Nordic integration to increase resilience. What in particular do you believe needs to be strengthened, and which challenges really are the priority here? And what are the concrete ways of going about this? What are the solutions?
Well, we are so blessed that we have the Nordic Council of Ministers, where the prime ministers in each Nordic country, back in 2019, adopted a vision for the Nordic region to become the most integrated and sustainable region in the world by 2030. They did that in 2019. They meet every year. This summer reconfirmed this is where we want to go in the Nordics. And having this very clear, strong mandate, very clear direction, that's of course long-term, but being integrated, being this very well-functioning region, and in the world we are the 11th largest economy. So we are a player, and we are open for business, and we are indeed in the forefront on so many terms. So what we do and what we need is, of course, to showcase and to keep on investing in new opportunities, the best knowledge. As you say, knowledge wins. Knowledge is base for every single solution, every single decision being made. So that's the core of the job that we do in the Nordic Council of Ministers, and making sure that we create these arenas where people talk to each other.
But is there a risk that there are too many forums, too many forums of discussion. I mean, you've got the Council of Baltic Sea States, you've got the Nordic Council of Ministers, the Arctic Council, the Barents Euro Arctic Council. I mean, should we be reconsidering perhaps the purpose of all of them to make sure that it's really defined and that the cooperation is as best as possible? I mean, how can you keep all of these staying so relevant?
We should definitely not say that there are too many. I mean, these are all important stakeholders, all important forums to make sure that we have the dialogue and the progression going. And then at the end, I mean, we are here in the Arctic, I mean, the Nordic countries being very, very strong democracies and having worked so for many, many years. We have a bulletproof model here. And having different forums for different topics, knowing what we are dealing with at different offices, different levels, that's extremely important. So in the Nordic Council of Ministers, I see us as a supplement to the Arctic Council and vice versa. We are dealing, of course, in the overall with the main objectives of making a green transition, making sure that there are good and great lives for our children and grandchildren. So that's our main obstacle. I mean, at the core of all of this we're discussing, many of you said it already, the core is people. People living here, people having and looking forward to prosperous lives.
Well, let me put that to you, Oren, because you did allude to it earlier. Do you think there needs to be a better definition, a demarcation of the roles of different forums? And you mentioned, of course, the role of the Arctic Council. Could they dovetail better together?
Well, I think it's a complex question. I mean, in some cases, there is or could be a fairly clear functional differentiation. That is to say, one organization has the mandate to deal with some issues, another organization with other issues. That's a fairly easy case, although it nevertheless may bear some clarification. The harder case is where there are kind of different levels and where you depend upon certain organizations to play some roles, but then they have to be dovetailed with other organizations to pick up the ball at a certain point and carry it to the next stage. And that's where the issue of the Arctic Council becomes very important. The Arctic Council, as I said before, does not have the authority or the resources to make and implement decisions. So it needs to understand exactly what its comparative advantage is. Its comparative advantage lies in early warning, identifying issues, emerging issues at an early stage, framing them, formulating for policy discussion, bringing together a multiplicity of players to share thoughts and innovative ideas. And that has some very, very fundamental consequences for the Arctic Council going forward.
But hasn't that ability been hampered by the current geopolitical situation with Russia? I mean, this question has come in. Half the Arctic is in Russia, and scientific study of the Arctic is starting to disintegrate as much as the rest of the world disconnects from Russia. Studying the non-Russian Arctic doesn't fully solve the problem, and we urgently need to solve it. Can we reconnect with Russian Arctic science without giving comfort to the Russian state? What kind of approach do you think should be taken in this respect?
Thank you. I'm glad you asked that question. I mean,
thank you for whoever posed it.
Yes, thank you. There's no easy and simple answer to this. We cannot solve this, I think, in terms of formal organizational actions. I think the only way forward under the current conditions, which are seriously problematic, is at the human level, where we have relationships or connections among actual specific human beings. And there we have developed over the last 45 to 50 years an Arctic community, a community of human beings who know each other, who are able to communicate easily with each other, and who have a certain degree of trust even in these times on a personal scale. And I think it's not perfect. We wish things were different, but the only way forward, I think, today to answer that question, to overcome these difficulties, is to maintain and to make use of this network of human beings who have developed over a long period of time relationships of personal connection, and I would say even trust. It's not perfect, but it's better. It's a heck of a lot better than nothing.
Thank you, Oren. Yeah, and it's a really crucial point, and it actually comes to a point that, as well, Andreas, you were making earlier, that keeping those channels of communication open. It's a very complex situation, but pragmatism, we've heard that a lot already today. Do you think that has to be the way forward?
Yes, I mean, international relations, the world is complex, right? I also wake up in the morning and read news from Ukraine and get emotionally distressed and want to cut all form of communication. I'm not the prime minister or the foreign ministers. I don't have to make decisions, thankfully. But you get these emotional responses, and I understand that. But at the same time, in Norway, for example, we share a large maritime space with Russia. We need to continue the co-management of certain fish stocks. We need to collaborate also on the science matter. And even in an Arctic Council setting, continuation of collaboration on lower working group projects with Russian scientists has commenced. So it's seeing the world as a bit more complex. But also to the governance question, though, how do you deal with Arctic governance in a time of crisis? I mean, governance inherently in the Arctic is done at the state level. I mean, as Oren says, the Arctic Council is not the end-all of Arctic governance. I understand that the Arctic states themselves have sometimes played up the role of the Arctic Council, and it definitely has a very important role, but the level of governance is rather complex, and at the end, it ends with the state. It's the states who are deciding how to progress with these issues. So in the case of Norway, for example, when the Norwegian foreign minister says that Norway is prioritizing the Arctic, we're focusing on the Arctic also for geopolitical reasons, for security reasons, then investments, measures, means must come from the government. And that's also what we're seeing in Norway, though, that there's increased questions asked, at least, about is the Norwegian government doing enough? If the Arctic is becoming increasingly important, not only for climate issues or for the green shift, the green transition, but also in global politics, how are we responding as a government or as a country?
Okay, and that leads on actually to another question that we have, which has come through for you, Karen Ellerman. You say the Nordic wants to be the environmentally friendly place in the world by 2030. How do you want to reach this green transition within 6 years when you've been working it already for 5 years with very little results? If you could respond to that.
Well, looking at every single governmental program in each of the Nordic states, it's in the core of every single program. And of course, the war of aggression in Ukraine kind of emphasized it even more with the independence of fossil fuels. And I fully, of course, agree with the Minister of Foreign Affairs saying that we are in the middle of the shift, and in that shift, we still do fossil fuels in the Nordics, but what we also do and keep on doing is spending lots of good taxpayers' money on research, on developing, on making every single specific programs, on actually testing. For instance, the green aviation. I mean, right now we have within the Nordic Council of Ministers and this kind of core funding, making sure that I think by 28 we will actually have the first commercial flights on battery aviation. That is possible because we collectively support these kind of initiatives. We do it totally on the energy market, a totally integrated energy market in the Nordics. So yes, there are not many years to 2030, but I feel actually quite confident and seeing, proof of all of this testing and research that we are doing to making sure that we are able to do this kind of shift and doing it in a cooperative way, not forgetting, I think that's a very important point to make also, the dialogue and cooperation with indigenous peoples.
Okay, and we have to see the Arctic as well from the perspective outside the Arctic. And particularly as well, the media coverage, it can vary widely depending on where you are in the world. Andreas, what's your take on media coverage of Arctic issues? There does appear to be a lot of emphasis on the negative, and how can you operate in that negative space?
Well, I'm an academic, so I love hating on media. It's the pastime of academics. And I'm actually, when I see these media headlines that often simplify things, or they tend to equate everything that happens in the Arctic in one headline, Arctic geopolitics, or new Cold War in the Arctic, cold winds blowing in the Arctic, all that stuff. I'm in a dilemma because I want attention to Arctic issues, to Arctic security concerns, to the research that we are doing, Arctic governance, as Oren is talking about. Would I rather that these journalists do not write at all? No, perhaps not. So I think we have a job to do. Perhaps it's the academics' job, perhaps it's the ministers, Nordic Council of Ministers, the governments, or it's a collective effort also during conferences like this to actually educate about the nuances. Yes, there are security concerns in the Arctic, but it's not because of a resource race, right? There's nuance and complexity to these issues. But inherently, I think media, you focus on the negative. And I think stories about imminent conflict in the Arctic attract much more attention.
The problem is there's always this real collision of demand for the stories to get prominence. And you often have to argue the case around an editorial table about why your story should gain prominence. And so having the right headline can actually be key in making sure it's on the news at all.
But think about your readers. They don't want all this conflict all the time. I mean, readers need solutions. You listen to the young ones here, and they wake up worried. They wake up depressed because when they open the news, when they turn on the television, it's all disasters. Yes, there are lots of disasters, but there are also solutions and possibilities. And this is a joint responsibility for media as well, to actually showcase the possibilities, the stories of the good lives being lived in this region, for instance.
True. So please then stop showing these pictures of Arctic ice melting and polar bears dying. I mean, it's a reality, yes, but I don't think there's anyone out there really questioning whether or not Arctic ice is melting. And Arctic ice is not melting because of actions taken by Arctic citizens. It's melting because of people driving cars in Brussels or London. So I mean, focus on the local environmental issues that are taking place and how to solve them.
That you say that, but actually the BBC, where I worked for 17 years, they would say we're not running this story unless it's solutions-based journalism. So at least that point, I think, certainly is getting across, but perhaps a bit more needs to be done. Well, let me bring in Oscar now, because in terms of of what's new, or what advances in technology do you think could help really solve some of the issues that we've been talking about here? And do you think that there is a lot of appetite among the media for those types of solutions?
Yeah, and I must say I can't complain around all the tensions we're getting from the investments that's being done in the north part of Sweden. Not everything is north of the Arctic Circle, but the big investments in fossil-free production of steel, which we need to build our future transportations, even if it's a battery-driven car, or a bridge, or a house. I mean, this is happening in the northern part of Sweden, and it's attracting investors from across the world. And we team up with our friends in the US and in Canada. I spent the first weeks of this year in Australia. They know more about small towns outside Luleå and Boden than I do, because I'm from south of Sweden. So we should definitely not complain. And once again, come back to the reality. We are attractive for investments because we offer fossil-free solutions. We have a sustainable approach. We are ahead of many of our competitors in the world. And that's why we have investments in Luleå, in the big data centers, for instance. And we also offer a way of living with respect to the human rights of free and fair societies. And an excellent environment. And that is widely known across the world, as I see it.
And as far as investments are concerned, anything with AI stamped on it seems to, there seems to be a frenzy for it right now. Certainly if you look at the valuations on Wall Street, what advances in AI do you think could really move the dial in the realm that you're working in?
Yeah, I think we have only seen the beginning of the AI revolution, and AI is big. And once again, we in the Nordic has a competitive advantage. We have our language. We are building our language models together. In the Wallenberg sphere, we have one PhD in AI coming out every week. We recently had a seminar in Oslo together with Oslo University, with all the Scandinavian countries in the trilateral commissions, together with now the US ambassador left, together with US. So we have a lot to offer, and I'm sure, and we're sure, that we will see AI in almost all applications of industrial productions and also consumer services. And this is happening now, and that's why we need in the Scandinavian to get this right, and also in the European Union, for those of us, Espen, who are members of the European Union, to get the policy right when it comes to what AI should do and not do. And I'm a bit concerned now that most of the investments is going to the United States right now. And that's also a piece of conversation between the French presidents and our Prime Minister right now in Sweden.
Well, we'll pick up on some of those themes in particular in our discussions about AI on Thursday afternoon. But Oren, I'd just like to give you the last word. I mean, how do we communicate all these issues more effectively in the media? Who do you think is responsible for doing that? What should we be doing going forward?
Well, I'm not a journalist, so I can't say that, but I think there's a critical need for better communication, not in the written article, but before the articles are written, for these different communities to sit down in an atmosphere of mutual respect and talk through in depth the issues, so that when the journalists attempt to distill the essential ideas, they do so with an understanding of the complexity and the nuances. I mean, I'm terribly concerned that in our focus on issues of military security, we lose track of human security, social security, environmental security. I mean, the great crises in the lifetimes of the young people we saw on the screen are not, I mean, the Ukraine war will eventually end, but the impacts of climate change will not end in their lifetimes, and it will have absolutely profound consequences for them, whether they live in the Arctic or whether they live in the subarctic in Oslo or wherever. And we need not to lose track of that crisis while we deflect their attention through the narrative of this other kind of discourse.
Well, thank you.
Maybe we can do both.
Well, that is the challenge that we have. Well, thank you very much to the panel. I really do appreciate all your thoughts and all your insights and all the actions taken forward. So please do give the whole panel a round of applause. Thank you. Over to you, Andreas.
Yeah, I was told I have to move towards the light. Thank you very much for the very bright discussion. I probably asked the audience to think about what the right headline for the Arctic is or would be. And something I was missing, though, from the discussion was we heard a lot about how the outside is affecting the Arctic, but we didn't hear a lot about how that outside can actually be more incorporated in Arctic governance or not, because we have more and more interest from non-Arctic stakeholders, and that interest will only increase. So they need to be, or should not be, that's the question, included in Arctic debates. Next step, pause, coffee, water, whatever you need. Afterwards, a lot of side events you can go to on health, marine, ecosystem, innovations for sustainable maritime development, empowering Arctic citizens, etc., etc. Big picture tomorrow in the morning on rethinking Arctic development, and a lot of mingling and network tonight. Famous Petra Kutscher with our Jenny, Pabina organized by Andreas, and a mayor's reception organized by the very one and only Patty Bruns. So please mingle, network, talk to everyone, and rethink the Arctic headlines of the future. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a great debate. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Climate change is affecting Inuit and other indigenous livelihoods. To me, coexistence in the Arctic is what we are doing now, coexisting in the Arctic with the inhabitants' environment and resources. What are we doing now to sustain and protect the Arctic, and how are we incorporating indigenous people's knowledge into our daily lives and decision-making processes? Yes, in my life, I ensure that I educate myself on my Inuit values.
For me, coexistence is about creating a space where everything and everyone can thrive side by side. It's about a space where we can protect our legacy, our heritage, our traditions without disrespecting or neglecting beliefs or freedoms of other human beings or animals or even nature itself. It's about the mutual respect, it's about dialogue, which will contribute to creating such a space which will be harmonious and will be nurturing for everyone. I do have a role in creating and ensuring coexistence in the Arctic through my research, collaboration with various stakeholders, and teaching, where I'm specifically concerned about how can we balance economic prosperity, environmental protection, and societal welfare.
To me, coexistence is a complex term. I must admit I feel a little bit ambivalent about it, especially the way it's sometimes used in debates. I think that coexistence should be built on a foundation of truth and reconciliation. In my work, I'm often in conversations about making space for different knowledges and worldviews, and I think that is important for coexistence in the Arctic.